One of the many privileges of my position as a sort of dilettantish internet enthusiast in philosophy, rather than, say, a professor or an academic or someone with a real job, is that I'm free to present a lot of my thoughts midway through their formulation in sort of woefully incomplete expositions without subsequently torpedoing my reputation. So please think of the following statements not as some kind of grand theory of nihilism or as a neat solution to it or as a final answer, but instead as just sort of one point along a train of thought, which will hopefully be altered by tomorrow morning, almost certainly at the behest of some of the questions and objections that you will no doubt bring to it. As I just mentioned, today's subject is nihilism, and sort of consequently what we might be able to do about it. I'll be giving some of my recent thoughts on the topic. I'll be introducing you to what I think is one of the most exciting interpretations of Nietzsche in recent years. And I'll also be arguing why I think so many of our discussions about nihilism and about so-called meaning are so very unproductive. And I'll be trying to point in some directions in which our popular existential discussions can be brought a little bit closer to earth and hopefully thereby allow us to make a little bit of progress. Yesterday, incidentally, I attended my grandfather's funeral, as he has recently passed away from pancreatic cancer. My dad was with him on the day that he passed, and in the subsequent days after his passing, we spent an awful lot of time reflecting on the last few hours of his life, because there's something very interesting about it. This was a man who knew death would come for him literally before the sun set that day. So how did he react to this? And out of the whole day, one particular story sticks in my mind. You see, my grandfather lived in a very old house in Oxfordshire and had a very old-fashioned electricity meter, bereft of a smart meter, as many of us will have. Each month, he thus had to manually send off readings from this meter to the electricity company, who would then provide him with this. But we've probably all done this. You know what I'm talking about. But the important fact here is that the electricity meter was placed quite high up in the kitchen. It was above a cupboard, and my grandfather's wife, who's about 5'2", couldn't reach it. One of my grandfather's final requests, as spoken to my dad at the point where to even croak was both painful and effortful, was for my dad to go and check the meter reading, because his wife was unable and he would soon be dead. And I thought this was fascinating and to a certain extent a little bit inspiring, because here he was, staring death in the face, and he still had something worth exerting himself over. In this case, that thing was the love he held for his wife. So even at the most precarious moment of his existence, he didn't have just an idle passivity. There was something worth doing. He wasn't resigned to life or resigned to death. He found it motivating right up to the last breath. I'll be mentioning a number of different thinkers in this talk, but the two that really frame the discussion will be John Stewart, who wrote a wonderful book called Nihilism in the 19th Century, and Bernard Regenster, who wrote a similarly wonderful book on Nietzsche called The Affirmation of Life. Both of these works have excellent analyses of nihilism, and I'll be incorporating both of them heavily into what I say today. So let's begin with John Stewart. The key phrase I want you to bear in mind here when it comes to Stewart's analysis of nihilism is broken promises. We all know what it's like when someone breaks a promise to us, just an ordinary promise or an important everyday one. First of all, we almost certainly feel angry at them for not keeping their word, and we also feel disappointed, maybe quite deeply disappointed, that the promised situation will not come to pass. Stewart's view of nihilism, to simplify somewhat, is that over the course of the 19th century, a whole series of promises that were made between man and the universe were broken or at least partially discredited. They were thrown into doubt, let's say. If you would have asked a reasonably educated person in 1801 what they thought their place in the universe was, they could have just told you outright. They were a creature made in the image of God with a rational nature and an immortal soul. They dwell here now on this fallen earth, but one day they'll be reconciled with their creator in heaven, destined for eternal life. Stewart outlines a number of ways in which this picture was thrown into doubt by 1901. Darwin's theory of evolution provided a slightly contrasting picture of man, where he wasn't unique among the animals, he was just part of a continuous process. We're not the finished product, we are one contingent stage. The existence of God was called into question by atheistic and agnostic philosophers, as well as the general success of bare naturalism as a philosophical and scientific program. And with natural certainty in the existence of God, also went natural certainty in the existence of an immortal life. Our general place in the world is unmoored. It's very easy to caricature this picture. I'm certainly not saying that ardent atheism was rife in 19th century Europe. That would be totally ahistorical. It's rather that, to sort of riff on a thought by the Christian philosopher Charles Taylor, it went from being impossible not to believe in God, which is sort of the outlook of let's call it the medieval peasant. He sometimes uses that image, so I'm going to borrow it, to then, by the end of the 19th century, and then subsequently this process has continued, God and the sort of cultural narrative that came with that being one option amongst many. Of course, this process begins far before the 19th century, but Stewart is arguing that this is a real turning point. Natural faith gives way to nagging doubt, and the promises of certainty were broken. So, when we're talking about nihilisms, things that people feel hopeless about in the present day, I think we should look for places where there has been something like a perceived broken promise in some area of life. As I'll go on to say, I think that it is often more productive to talk about nihilisms rather than capital N nihilism. Take information, for example. It's very easy to forget this now, but one of the promises of the early internet in the 90s, before I was born, was that it would make us all much, much smarter by democratizing our access to information. Now anyone could get an undergraduate course's worth of information on biology or literature or maths with just a few clicks of their mouse. Surely, we thought, this would usher in a new age of grand intelligence, better learning, and more informed citizens. Such dreams seem slightly quaint and naive now, and as a result, I think we can safely say that the promises of a gilded age of abundant information were sort of broken. Is it any surprise then that so many people feel disillusioned with information itself, and that, at least for a certain subsection of the population, people are desiring to know less, thinking that this will lend them orientation? Anti-intellectualism, at least for some, may be a response to seeing such a dramatic rise in access to information without a corresponding rise in edification or existential orientation. Broken promises, for Stewart, give way to nihilism. Bernard Regenster, who's the other thinker we'll be talking about today, has a different, but I would argue very complementary analysis of nihilism. And one of his big innovations is to draw the distinction between two types of nihilism, a nihilism of despair and a nihilism of disorientation. A nihilism of despair is when we still value something very, very highly, yet we think it's unattainable. So, say, for example, that you were a devout Christian and then one day you lost your faith. This actually did happen to a friend of mine, and he was understandably distraught, right? The goal of serving and loving God had been the fulcrum on which his entire life turned, and now it was gone, brutally and without a replacement. He was in nihilistic despair because he still wanted to serve and love God. That was the only thing that he really valued, but he no longer thought that it was possible to do this. That is a nihilism of despair. The object is still valued, but it is seen as unattainable. A nihilism of disorientation is slightly different. This is where we're nihilistic in the sense of being directionless. We don't know what to value, and so subsequently we don't know what to do. This disorientation came at a slightly later date for my newly faithless friend. Once he had gradually let go of the idea that God would be the only thing that could lend his life motivating worth, but didn't yet have another ideal to replace it. He sort of didn't know at this point what was important to him, but also this disorientation was not nearly as acutely unpleasant as nihilistic despair. It manifested as a kind of aimlessness. And once he found other things to value, this too gradually ebbed away. I think that these two types of nihilism are worth separating out because ultimately they point to two very different emotional states. Being confused is not the same thing as being distraught. Nonetheless, they do point to a relatively unified solution, that of crafting a new ideal. And crafting a new ideal is something that, as we will see, is an easy thing to say and a complete ball ache to do. One point in which I differ from both Stewart and Regenster is that I prefer to see nihilism as topic relative. We touched on that a little bit earlier. I think it is often more useful to think about nihilism regarding this or nihilism regarding that, rather than just talking about whether someone is capital N nihilistic. This is partly because, in practice, I think that whether someone considers their life as a whole worth living will depend on whether they consider particular parts of it worth living for. I'm certainly open to being proven just empirically wrong on this point. It's ultimately an empirical hypothesis and an empirical claim. I just don't think that it makes much sense for someone to say that their life is pointless, but also that there are loads of things within their life that are valuable and fulfilling and worth living for. Or if they do, I think they might just be using the term valuable differently than I do. I also think that considering nihilism in this more piecemeal topic relative way can do something to get us out of the abstract world and put us back on the ground where we have slightly more manageable questions. But this view also has some implications. I don't just see the need for one grand new ideal to march in and solve big bad nihilism once and for all. I instead see things more like an ongoing quest for new ideals in any area of life, big or small, in which we feel nihilistic and that causes us distress. Incidentally, this also makes me quite skeptical of suggestions that we can solve big N nihilism once and for all with just one change, like returning to a religious worldview. So take just one example of this. Earlier in the day, there was a discussion over whether someone is inevitably settling in long-term relationships. Some of you may have been here for that debate, some of you may not have been. The reason that I think people saw this question as worth asking, the reason why we care about it, is because this question is asking whether a given ideal that we have about love is unattainable. If someone is always settling in a long-term partnership, then the idea that we can have long-term relationships where both people are one another's top preferred person, so to speak, is untrue. And thus, a significant ideal of love is proven unattainable, and hence, a certain topic-relative nihilism of despair about romance is ushered in. I like romance as an example here, partly because you see forms of romantic nihilism, especially nihilisms of despair, crop up an awful lot online. I think this is partly because romantic love is seen as such an important area of our lives, so anything that feels a bit off regarding love is felt pretty acutely. But also, troubles in love are highly concentrated among young people, and we've all trained ourselves to spew our complaints out into the internet, which, by the way, is absolutely wonderful. Please do continue to do that, because it's fantastically informative for people like me. I don't know if it helps the person posting, but it certainly helps me reading. But I do think it's worth noting, a nihilism about romance does not necessarily imply a nihilism in other areas. This is where the advantage of a topic-relative approach comes in. There are Christians who might be nihilistic about romance. One example you might pick about this are certain monastics who have seen it as an obstacle to their ultimate relationship with God. Likewise, there are people who are nihilists about God, but not about romance. There are people who despair of our ability to have reliable information about the world, who nonetheless find value in their family and friends, and so on. Within this framework, we can consider nihilism in all sorts of areas, and I think that it just makes nihilism a little bit more of a precise and manageable beast. It also suggests that sometimes the solutions might not be philosophical, they might be straightforwardly material, and I'll come on to this point later. But to give an example of that, a great many people around my age, and many of your ages across the UK, display a distinct or underlying nihilism about the prospect of adult life, about adult roles and adult responsibilities. And I would argue that much of this just isn't to do with philosophy at all. At least as much of it has to do with things like house prices. Home ownership has been seen as, at least for the past few generations, as an important ideal to achieve to become a fully complete adult who, to use a common phrase, has their shit together. Thus, when such a valuable milestone becomes unattainable and is perceived as unattainable, there is an ensuing nihilism of despair about that particular domain. We thus separate we don't so separate. We actually kind of start to erode the separation between many so-called ordinary forms of despair or hopelessness and this kind of abstract existential nihilism that we often talk about. I've not settled on a name for this position. I'm sure it's not unique to me. I'm thinking of calling it pluralistic nihilism or nihilistic pluralism or some variant on that, because, it's always nice to have a label for something like this. But I should also point out here that this is sort of a minority viewpoint, and so it may be totally and utterly incorrect. I just think it's a promising route forward. I'm a big fan of making philosophical issues less to do with abstract and mysterious stuff and connecting them directly to something practical. I think this is one way to do this for nihilism, and I think we could approach a lot more philosophical issues in this way. C.S. Peirce talks about this an awful lot, and I feel like I always bang on about him. So anyway, with that groundwork laid, I want to, broadly speaking, ask the following question. How do we craft a new ideal within a particular domain? After all, if the solution to these nihilisms is going to be crafting new ideals, then we're going to need a pretty good grasp of what this process in general looks like, because we're likely going to have to do it over and over and over again in a whole range of different fields of life. The first thing that I want to note here is that crafting a new ideal is really hard in a way that's subtly different from some other philosophical problems. The particular difficulty of creating an ideal arises because what we value is not, for the most part, a conscious choice, nor is it some kind of neat intellectual exercise that you can simply reason out. My area during my master's degree was logic, where you begin with a set of axioms and some rules, and you logic your way towards a particular conclusion. That's simply inadequate, in my view, for the process of crafting ideals. I don't think it matters whether I provide you with some kind of perfect proof as to why you really ought to value a certain thing. I don't even know what such an argument would look like. But if it doesn't resonate with you, it just won't stick. This is because, contrary to some great philosophical hopes of the past 2 millennia, I don't think that humans are ruled simply by our rational faculties. We have instincts, we have affects, we have emotions, both beautiful emotions and ugly emotions, but more importantly, motivating emotions. And moreover, these are not just aberrant pieces of our psychology that can be brushed aside by the overwhelming power of reason and facts and logic. They are, to a great extent, in the driver's seat, and our reason is often just trying to steer it in the right direction as much as it can. So, given this difficulty and the particular nature of this difficulty, it may help to take one particular topic that has already been given an in-depth treatment by someone far, far, far cleverer than me. So I thought we would look a little bit at how Nietzsche thought we could consider our suffering valuable and worthwhile even after the death of God. And even if you don't agree with this, I think that it will give some good food for thought and some good structural insight. Again, I'll largely be drawing from Regenster's interpretation here. So under Regenster's interpretation, the grand philosophical project of Friedrich Nietzsche, at least is in what is commonly referred to as the therapeutic part of it, as opposed to the sort of naturalistic or descriptive part of it, was to begin the process of crafting a new ideal to replace that of God, and more broadly, to replace that of permanent fulfillment, what's sometimes called permanent being. Here on in, when I say Nietzsche, just assume that I am using that as shorthand for Nietzsche according to Regenster. I'm a bit pessimistic about ever discovering what Nietzsche meant about anything, really. So I prefer to treat him and his interpreter as sort of an odd, slightly dysfunctional couple. I'll give a brief and somewhat oversimplified rundown of Regenster's thesis here. Essentially, for Nietzsche, with the death of God, we had lost the thing that made the sufferings in this life all worthwhile. If you're a Christian, you're going through a very hard time, say. You can always think to yourself, at least in the next life, there is something great awaiting me. The prospect of eternal union with God justifies all the suffering in this life. This picture is not limited to Christianity. The way of spotting a worldview like this is that it says, on the one hand, that suffering is an unalloyed bad and that life is potentially wretched because there is this suffering in the world, and then solves that problem brought in by the introduction of a wholesale condemnation of suffering by saying that we have the potential to reach some kind of salvation in a permanent state of satisfied being. This is why Nietzsche, incidentally, thinks that the dreaded ascetic ideal has lasted so long. He says it is the only way thus far that we've been able to make sense of suffering. And remember, for Nietzsche, it's not so much suffering that causes us such incredible discomfort, sort of existential despair. It is senseless suffering. So, we have a value system where permanent satisfaction is the thing that we're striving after, and we need that permanent satisfaction because it's the way that we justify our lives in the face of suffering that we have condemned wholesale. So, what's the problem? Well, the problem for Nietzsche is that God is dead and we have killed him. One of the things that makes the death of God so potentially destructive for Nietzsche is that it implies that this permanent state of being is unattainable. There is no heaven waiting for us after this life without God. So we're left with the same problem as before. How do we deal with the sufferings of this world, considering that we wholesalely consider them as negative? But we don't have the answer that brought us such consolation and direction. When we suffer now, it's not for anything. It's not building towards some brighter future. And if we truly grasp this, according to Nietzsche, we will find it unbearable. At this point, we are in the Regensteirian nihilism of despair. Life has become an irredeemable and painful march without a positive end in sight. We're now truly in the position of Sisyphus. So, Nietzsche, or to remind you, Regenster's Nietzsche, crafts a philosophy with which we can, in his view, affirm life with all its suffering in the absence of permanent satisfaction. He's going to try and do that by trying to undermine the wholesale condemnation of suffering, to sort of weaken that as an objection to life. So, importantly, this isn't about making suffering sort of a thing that we have to get through. Life is something worthwhile in spite of suffering. This is about making suffering an essential component of a good life. Because for Nietzsche, he wants to be able to affirm the whole of life, even without heaven. We go through the nihilisms of despair and disorientation towards a new way of valuing life. And this is how Regenster's Nietzsche aims to liberate us from nihilism. Of course, when you talk about things like a not wholesale condemnation of suffering, it's very easy to think that Nietzsche is saying this from some kind of ivory tower. I do like to remind people that Nietzsche himself suffered from an incredibly, horribly painful chronic illness for his entire life. So he's speaking very much from at least partly a place of very much personal experience here. This interpretation of Nietzsche uses the will to power as the replacement ideal. Now, how to interpret the will to power is very much an open discussion in Nietzsche literature, a discussion that I think will never end. Some interpreters think that Nietzsche puts it forward as a kind of descriptive psychological principle, that all people desire to express their strength most fully, as he puts it in The Genealogy of Morals. Others view it as Nietzsche's principle for life, or even for the world, drawing on an unpublished declaration that the world is will to power and nothing else besides. Regenster takes a slightly different approach. For him, the will to power is normative. He thinks that Nietzsche considers the will to power good and wishes to use that to create a new value system. But importantly, the will to power for Regenster is not like a will to dominate. It's not like, you go and hit your friend round the head and then you'll be happy. For Regenster, the will to power is the will to overcome resistance. That's Nietzsche's phrase when he describes the will to power. He describes it as the will to overcome resistance. And this kind of breaks down into quite a complex picture of willing. On the one hand, you have to wish for there to be some impediment towards your desire to accomplish something, what's called your first order desire. But then you also have to have the wish to overcome that resistance. The paradigm example here, which I think very much helps bring this rather abstract picture down to earth, is something like a sporting contest. Nietzsche himself uses the example of the argon from ancient Greece. So let's say that you and I are having some kind of lifting competition, like who can bench press the most weight. It will be very boring for us if the other doesn't pose any kind of challenge. If I'm in a bench press competition against Arnold Schwarzenegger, neither of us are going to have a particularly fulfilling time. It's going to be incredibly dull. The best case scenario for any kind of competition is that we do beat the other person, but that it is a real challenge. That is, there is resistance to our goal, but we overcome that resistance, and the very resistance itself is the thing that makes the overcoming valuable. Obviously, this is a simplification, but I do think it helps illustrate the general point. For Regenster, Nietzsche is taking this rather interesting structure of willfully overcoming resistance that necessarily you yourself have willed, and then using that as the cornerstone of his new values. This is, according to Regenster, how Nietzsche can affirm suffering, since suffering is no longer considered a negative part of life, but instead something that must be willed in order to be overcome. In essence, if we have what sometimes he refers to as a strong will to power, and that is the focus of our value system, then, Nietzsche posits, we will not need the old ideal of heaven, since we have a way to affirm suffering directly. There's no longer a sense that suffering needs to be justified, because, at least if he succeeded, suffering is no longer considered to be an objection to life. Hence, the old ideal is replaced with a new one. Well, I've got a hair in my mouth. And nihilism is refuted. That's been bothering me for about 5 minutes now. So, just to remind everyone of the general structure here. Nietzsche has attempted to replace a value system aimed at achieving permanent fulfillment and freedom from suffering to one aimed at striving for ever greater resistances to overcome, and including all of the sufferings and frustrations of life in that resistance. Under this new picture, life is no longer Sisyphus rolling the same boulder up the hill each day and seeing it crash back down only to do the same thing over and over again. It's instead him demanding bigger and heavier boulders over time so that he has even greater resistances to overcome. It's a value system that thus explicitly denies both the prospect and even the desirability of freedom from suffering. And look, there's a lot there. I really hope that you'll check out Regence's book if you want to learn more about it, because it's fantastic. I largely want to note the structure. Nietzsche has replaced an idea that suffering was a negative that had to be justified with a value system where suffering was an essential part of what is valued. Thus, he is attempting to overcome both the nihilism of despair and the nihilism of disorientation in the wake of the death of God, and is able to affirm life again. However, there's something very important about the way that Nietzsche goes about trying to construct this new value system here. Because when he argues for it, he doesn't just make what we would recognize as arguments. They're in there, don't get me wrong, but he also appeals to instincts. So take a lot of talk in Nietzsche's works, especially in Beyond Good and Evil and The Gay Science and Thus Spake Zarathustra. He often talks about things like strength and power and stuff like that. And to paint the conflicts of values in these kind of grand martial terms, to paint things in terms of strength and oppression and greatness, it's not just empty rhetoric, at least in Regence's analysis. It serves a purpose in Nietzsche's philosophy. Its aim is to make the new ideals seem attractive to our affects and our instincts and all those emotions we were talking about earlier. Likewise, in the Genealogy of Morals, where Nietzsche, and in the Antichrist, by the way, where Nietzsche sort of attempts to heap what many of us would regard as basically rhetorically excessive attacks on Christian ideas and Christianity, it would be a mistake to consider this just a kind of stylistic excess. The interesting thing, actually, incidentally, about the Genealogy of Morals is that Nietzsche thinks that a lot of his genealogical critique of Christianity is basically like besides the point, his actual problem with it. It is sort of a rhetorical tool. But again, I think it's very, very interesting. The point of his language here is to disenchant us from the old ideal that he thinks is going to lead us to nihilism, and you can agree with him or disagree with him on that, to make way for a new one. And he's trying to use one aspect of our value system, the aspect that he thinks is sort of left over from pre-Christian times, which is our kind of admiration for strength and creativity and for overcoming resistance and for, what he sometimes calls greatness, that doesn't necessarily resemble our kind of lay concept of greatness. To undermine the other part, the part that he thinks is a wholesale condemnation of suffering. Nietzsche is often explicit on this point. He sometimes sees his own writings as simply a prelude to these values eventually being adopted and developed by a certain number of people. Because he's Nietzsche and he's basically kind of an elitist, he sometimes refers to these as his higher types. But we can kind of, again, I'm largely focusing on the structure here. In Daybreak, he puts this structure quite neatly when he says, we have to learn to think differently in order at last, perhaps very late on, to attain even more, to feel differently. And the reason that I've gone on this kind of rather long tangent about a particular part of Nietzsche's philosophy is because I think it's very good at illustrating what makes creating a new value or a new ideal, even within a particular circumspect domain, so very difficult. Because in order to do so, we have to appeal to our currently existing affects and instincts. And those affects and instincts have been shaped by the values that we've had already. As Regence sometimes puts it, Nietzsche doesn't only have to persuade us of his new values, he also has to seduce us into them. The fact that Nietzsche's value system has not really caught on, and indeed most people, myself very much included, remain quite skeptical of it, it's a testament to how hard the job of creating a new ideal truly is. Nietzsche makes it even more difficult because he doesn't want to just revalue any old ideal, he wants to revalue our highest ideal. So our more piecemeal revaluations in other areas of life might not be quite as hard a sell, but I still expect that they'll be difficult. So, building on this point, we need to ask what our options are for how to create new values, given the fact that it's not just a matter of rational and reasonable choice, sitting around at a table and just kind of hashing it out. It's also a matter of gradually seducing our emotions as well as our cognition. So there are a few different routes I can take. They're broadly along the continuum of just how radical a departure you're trying to get from what you currently consider valuable or instinctive. One option is for the new value to be basically the same, but sort of a modified form of the existing value. I even sometimes hesitate to call this a value change, but I'm open to discussion there. This is again probably best illustrated by a personal example rather than a philosophical one. So a few years ago, a friend of mine went through quite a difficult breakup and proclaimed that the only kind of romantic partnership worth having was with his ex. I'm sure many of us have been in relatively similar situations and experienced relatively similar kinds of feelings. Nonetheless, as we all know, people in this situation eventually find someone else, and in this case, this new person became the new goal of his romantic pursuit. And I hesitate to call this a change of ideal. In this case, the two goals are so similar they can arguably be subsumed under the same goal, that of finding a romantic partner that makes you happy long term. But we could also look at these as two separate goals, right? One of being with the ex, the other of being with the new partner. And depending on how you cash this out, it can be kind of two different and I think rather interchangeable models here. This kind of shift retains an awful lot of faith in the old ideal. So if the old ideal truly is unattainable, this might not be appropriate to all circumstances. Another option, further along the scale of shifting values, is to borrow some kind of valuation from another sphere. I'm going to take a romantic example again. One of the key myths about romance that has shaped our ideal of erotic or romantic love is the one. This idea dates all the way back, arguably, to Aristophanes and Plato's Symposium, where he suggests that individual humans are actually one half of a great eight-limbed beast cleft in twain by the gods, and thus we seek to find our other half in this life. This idea that there's one person that is just made for us, that will instantly be perfect for us and is destined to be with us, is just no longer really tenable. We don't have the kind of metaphysical framework to argue for that. But it bubbles under the surface in the background of our modern romantic ideals. As Nietzsche might put it, its tombs and shadows still haunt us. And I think this is so much the case that I think a great many modern complaints about love can be traced back to this one myth. The ideal is recognized as unattainable. We sort of know that the one doesn't exist, and so people fall into nihilistic despair. So what might a new ideal look like here? Well, in order to make it straightforwardly attractive, in order to appeal to our affects and instincts, we might want to appeal to a concept that we already value, this time from the world of art, a labour of love. When we think of a labour of love, like Michelangelo working on David, or Proust slaving away over his great 7-part novel that I'd love to read at some point, but who the fuck's got the time? Or you yourself working on a project that you personally find very fulfilling. There, we picture fulfillment and value on the other side of quite a difficult, grueling, but ultimately motivating and felt valuable work. Under this picture of love, we should no longer expect effortless bliss, as in the myth of the love. As we analogize romantic relationships to labours of love, we can begin to see them as akin to difficult pieces of art, and it is the job of the lovers to slowly shape them into a master work. Bliss is no longer the starting point of love. We shouldn't even expect it, really, at the starting point of love. It is instead the culmination of years of meaningful effort. And thus, rather than thinking of people as settling for those that do not live up to their initial expectations, we see the relationship itself as the culmination of a shared labour of love, where we both learn to craft ourselves and our partner towards mutual joy. When I've raised this as an alternative picture of love in the past, I've got a generally pretty positive response. People seem relatively drawn to this. And I think that a big part of this is because it is explicitly drawing on values that we already find compelling in another field. I could even draw on compelling ideals within romance to illustrate it, like that of the elderly couple who have spent the last 50 years gradually growing closer, overcoming many challenges along the way, to the point where their last thoughts are of one another. This is, of course, a more substantial shift in values than the first route, but it still draws upon pre-existing evaluative frameworks. Of course, there are additional things to hash out here. One immediate question that hits me is, how consistent and coherent does our overall set of values relative to different topics have to be? That, as far as I can tell, is just an empirical point, but I do think it's an interesting question. A third route is to genuinely try to upend our highest values, to kind of start from scratch and try and build up with a different framework. This was, to a large extent, Nietzsche's goal for Regenster. And I think that it's one reason why his project strikes us as so very radical, and for many of us, a little bit repellent. This would be an incredibly substantial undertaking. It implies that we break continuity between what we already value and what we will value in the future. I think that, Nietzsche's rhetoric, I think, does have some success here. People often do come away from his books at least looking at our current value system a little differently, and perhaps with a little bit more sympathy for his replacement, especially if it's interpreted in terms of overcoming resistance rather than, kind of mindless domination. But also, the works of Nietzsche have clearly not ushered in an age of radically different values in the Western world. And I think this is going to likely be true for a lot of wide-scale attempts to change incredibly dearly held values without drawing upon pretty substantially strong competing values. Even Christianity, which is often touted as a radical break in our value system, and certainly has been over time, often had to subtly adapt itself to existing traditions where it first spread. There's a transition period here where continuity is sometimes created. We see this, arguably, in the letters of Paul, where at one point he seems to almost permit marriage as a kind of last resort if you really cannot remain celibate until the oncoming return of Christ. We also see this in the compromises that occur in Christianity's gradual adoption into the Roman Empire. The Emperor Constantine, for example, is thought to have worshipped Christ as one God amongst many, which, that's not how we recognize as monotheistic Christianity, right? The same is true of various polytheistic Germanic tribes in the initial stages of that tribe's conversion. So at the very least, it seems like often the total supplanting of one value system by another is quite a long process and seems to go through many intermediate stages that look quite a lot like more continuous value changes. So, to sum up the story so far, we have a few rough points. The first one, and this is kind of my main point really, is that nihilism, in my view, is best seen as relative to a particular domain. This will help us move nihilism away from being a vaguely defined feeling towards, reality as a whole, and it will help link it to specific situations in the world, which I think will allow us to make more progress on the issue. My second point is that, this is basically from Regenster, nihilisms of despair arise when something is perceived as both the cornerstone of value within a given domain and is also shown to be unattainable. For example, if God is shown not to exist, that will plausibly usher in nihilism regarding theism. If no long-term happy partnership were possible, then romantic nihilism would be a natural response. Nihilisms of disorientation, by contrast, arise when we are not sure what to value within a given domain. And if that given domain is important to us, that very well might cause us some kind of distress. But if it doesn't, then that may not particularly bother us. I'm open to the idea that topic-relative nihilisms of disorientation might not be too bad, depending on the field. In response to a nihilism of despair, and maybe a nihilism of disorientation, but focus on despair for now, we have a few options. Largely, they fall into two different camps. The first camp is to just leave the value in place and make it attainable again. This seems appropriate for situations where the goal is only unattainable due to contingent circumstances that we can actually change. Again, we mentioned home ownership before. I think it's a prime example of this. In my admittedly naive opinion, one of the biggest things we could do to combat nihilism about the future in young people is to attempt to fix the housing crisis. Of course, this too is easier said than done, but I just want to bring this up because fixing the housing crisis obviously isn't a philosophical solution. Because I don't think that nihilism is a uniquely philosophical problem, nor does it need a philosophical solution in all cases. We've actually taken this route in the past on a variety of different occasions. On the recommendation of Jared Henderson, I've recently been reading the book Too Much to Know by Blair. And that, among other things, documents what I would call nihilistic despair felt by Renaissance scholars in the aftermath of the printing press. Because suddenly the old ideal of becoming, familiar and learned regarding most of the major works out there on a topic was impossible. There was too much to know. Thus, a nihilism of despair about information and the idea of being informed naturally occurs. The fix, however, according to Blair, was not in a wide-scale change of ideal, or at least not wholly in that. It was also in the invention of various technologies like commonplace books, and this is where we see the rise of the encyclopedia and things like that. These would allow people to learn about some of these rapidly printed books if they didn't have time to study them for themselves. This was a practical solution to informational nihilism of despair. However, this only seems to work if the obstacle to attaining the previous ideal is contingent, because if it's something that has been false all along and now we're only just learning about it, like the myth of the one, I worry that we might risk trying to recapture a kind of mythical past that never existed, a sort of romantic utopia. And I'm not massively convinced that's always a productive route to go down. It's one of the reasons why I think it's important to find out whether what we're dealing with is contingent or necessary unattainability. The second camp, which is the more philosophical camp, consists of various ways to create new values in a given area. The different strategies employed will ultimately depend on the extent to which the values need to change, which will depend on to what extent the value is unattainable, whether there are similar options. The main difficulty facing large-scale revaluations in our values is that we can only judge whether a given proposal is valuable based on our current value system. So, for example, I don't think that people's worries about romance would be solved by ushering in some kind of Brave New World-style program of total romantic non-attachment and universal shagging. It's just so far from our current norms that I don't think many people would go for it. It doesn't sound appealing to me, and if a new ideal doesn't seem appealing to enough people, it's just unlikely to catch on. However, the whole time I've been speaking, I've had a slightly hidden motive, right? We have had, so far, a pretty extended chat about nihilism and about existential issues, and yet I very purposefully avoided the term meaning, and I haven't used the term meaning of life once. The idea that life has a meaning and that our job when we're doing existential philosophy is to go out and find it, or alternatively that life has no meaning and that we must therefore become total nihilists, is often the implicit background in many of our existential discussions, especially in the popular sphere. I think this framing is a mistake. I think we are being bewitched by the grammar of the question. What is the meaning of life? It makes it seem like our discussion is about an object, meaning, and how it applies to another object, life. And I think this immediately locks us into an endless debate about this mysterious object that I don't even know how to spot. And I just can't see how this way of approaching the question will get resolved. For example, it's pretty common for theists to say that without God, there's no meaning for life, and for atheists to say that you can have a meaning for life without God. But what does this actually mean? What is at stake here? Normally, it seems like what people are trying to get at is to ask whether you can consider life, or certain areas of life, motivating in the absence of a deity. How does the non-existence of immortality or of God change our approach to the world? But this way of framing the question is immediately more approachable. It partly becomes an empirical issue we can go out to investigate, but also we now kind of know what all the terms mean in a way that the meaning of life is very difficult to get a handle on. So what I hope this talk has demonstrated so far is that we can have a perfectly sensible discussion about nihilism without talking about this mysterious concept of meaning at all. We've talked about goals, we've talked about values, we've talked about ideals and behavior and emotion and instinct and suffering, but we just haven't needed to talk in terms of meaning. Take our discussion about Nietzsche earlier. Would it have added something to say, oh, and by the way, Nietzsche's talking about the meaning of life here? I just don't think it would. We can get by entirely by talking about emotional and motivational states, whether someone finds a particular goal worth expending effort over, and whether they are in despair about a particular topic, or about whether that person is reasonably feeling a certain way about a particular topic. Thus, I think the best way to move forward is to dispense with the category of meaning altogether, and instead talk about things that we can get an easier handle on. We can discuss certain emotional states like fulfillment or enjoyment, as well as behavioral dispositions like being motivated towards a certain set of actions. But ironically, I just don't think we need to talk about life's meaning to make progress with it. And in many ways, I think it sends us on a wild goose chase. And it's also worth noting, once we stop thinking in terms of objects called meaning, we can find completely new ways of looking at the problem. Something I've talked about before, a little bit regarding home ownership and the like, and but I've talked about it more in previous sort of talks and videos and stuff, is that a sense of felt meaningfulness about life is facilitated by a whole bunch of physical and psychological factors that don't seem existential or philosophical in character at all. A very obvious example of this, right? If someone is out on the street with no prospect of that ever changing, clearly, the most existentially important thing is for that person's material circumstances to change. If you've just been through a tragedy, then life might really feel meaningless. And that may just be part of the grieving process. If you're underslept or underfed or overworked or in a really financially precarious situation with very little light at the end of the tunnel, then the answer to nihilism just might not necessarily be philosophical. It might just be found in straightforward changes. I know this sort of thing sounds really obvious, but I do think it bears repeating because it's so easy to forget this if we are speaking in terms of abstract meaning rather than what kinds of things facilitate emotional states like fulfillment and broad-scale motivation. And look, existential philosophy is a difficult field. It deals in the messy and hard-to-define business of human emotion. I don't wish to deny its beauty or complexity in the slightest. And I absolutely do not want to reduce this down to some kind of cold logical calculus. I think I've made that reasonably clear. However, I really do want to make progress in these issues. I think that one way to do this is to interrogate terms like meaning, which seem so very elusive, and see if they can be cashed out in slightly clearer terminology. And ultimately, I hope that one of the things that I've somewhat demonstrated in this talk is that it is at least possible to discuss nihilism without mentioning the meaning of life. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of a break from talking. Thank you for that. That was incredible. We're going to go to audience questions. What we're going to do is we're going to go one at a time so that we can properly make sure we answer them in as much depth as possible. But please do try and make them fairly quick so we can get around as many people as possible. So any questions? Please raise your hands. Yes, over here.
You mentioned earlier that it's more productive to talk about the individual types of nihilism, but how would you discuss this without first a fundamental definition of what nihilism is? And how would you explain what nihilism is without a reclusive meaning to something that's never really found this out?
That's fair. I think that's a really good question. I think that you can have a sort of relatively minimal definition, almost just a formal definition of nihilism, if you wanted to talk about it merely in terms of topic relative spheres, where you would say something like, we're talking about whether someone is motivated to expend effort over something, whether they are in certain emotional states. One of the things I didn't talk about there, but I actually think is also a key part of this discussion, is that when we talk about somebody feeling nihilistic, even within a particular field, and even if we're just, right down to nihilisms of despair, well, we often mean different things by despair. Sometimes by despair, we mean a particular emotional state, like somebody's feeling really down. Sometimes we mean that someone has no willingness to exert effort over something. So, you see someone unable to get out of bed. It's there is an affective component there, but there's also a behavioral component. So I think that the way to, in my view, get more precise on these issues, and again, I'm totally open to being proven wrong about this. This is largely what I have found works in my own discussions, is to talk about the things we can see, like behavior, and things we can get an intuitive grasp on, like emotion, and build up from there. So if you're talking about, so that would be my kind of minimal formal idea of nihilism, or a minimal formal idea of a nihilism of despair. And then I think that we can start at that ground level and then build up from there. Does that make sense, Tor?
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, front row.
So, I think there's one potential approach to dealing with the phenomenological experience as a response to existential nihilism, but as nihilism an array of different potential approaches that we've thought through and the like. And I think, given the differences in their efficaciousness for each individual and how well they can do at addressing this feeling of nihilism, we require this implicit either standards by which we can judge these theories against each other for how well they can solve or address the emotional existential nihilism. Or there are an implicit array of functions more mental states within each individual, making them each theory more likely to address that emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, can the philosophical method account for these implicit emotions, or is this the limit of philosophy in this area, and can a different discipline do better at address it?
Well, I think that there is a sort of definitely an interdisciplinary scope here. For example, if you're asking what is the most productive framework in a given situation, what's the most productive new value we could possibly move to? Well, that's plausibly an empirical question, right? If you're in the process of attempting to craft a new ideal for something, and say you have 2 or 3 competing ideals on offer, well, one of them might just facilitate better life outcomes. It might genuinely alleviate the negative emotional and behavioral states we associate with things like nihilistic despair to a greater degree. And I'm willing to say this quite possibly could vary between people. I see no reason why everyone would end up with exactly the same ideals in every area. I think it'll make for a very dull existence, if nothing else. I think that obviously when we are enacting behaviors that affect other people, there's going to be a negotiating process that goes on there, right? There are values within a given community will need to interlock well enough that cooperation and communication can take place and things like that. But I think that is an empirical question. I wouldn't say that there's any way for a philosopher kind of sitting back theorizing about things to answer that. I think it is a psychological question.
Questions? Yes, over here.
You spoke previously about how nihilism isn't an objective and philosophical question. Does it need to have a philosophical answer? So would you say that it's more an issue that has to be coped with, or the cause is word to be eradicated? Do you think it would be able to cut it out of everyday life?
Well, I think that when I say that nihilism isn't a uniquely philosophical question, what I'm largely trying to get across there is that sometimes as people very interested in philosophy, we have a tendency to think that a question that's classically classed under philosophy, like questions of nihilism, only have philosophical solutions. And I want to push back on that because I think that, emotional states like despair and behavioral states like not being motivated to do anything have also very material and physical causes in a lot of cases. And that's kind of what I'm getting at there. Does that make sense? Is that... Okay, cool.
Yes, over here.
So to what extent do you think that topic-specific analysis can actually be extensive from just the general existential sense of analysis? For something in an area, especially like non-social, in central part of the human experience, if one is nice about that, surely it can just set the general worldview in a way that it's not quite so easy to fix or to draw lines and something like materialistic lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I think that like my idea regarding, treating topic relative nihilisms as like your ground level and then building up from there is to basically facilitate the kind of statement you've just made, which is to say something like, you're feeling nihilistic about love. Well, of course, that's going to have a wide scale negative impact on your very experience of being in the world in a way that maybe, some people are bothered less by things like being nihilistic about the state of information, or they might not be bothered by being nihilistic about, the future of a country or something like that, right? But they might find that love is the thing that really does tip over into just generally affecting their life. So I think that's what I think that kind of statement is exactly the kind of thing that I'm hoping, or I would hope that treating nihilism as a kind of topic relative thing would then allow us to do. So there, I think that's an excellent demonstration of that, hopefully.
Yes.
Is Nietzsche quite a bit more disjunctive in terms of Christianity coming along as the transvaluation of all values? So, he's got that great passage about God on the cross. Hitherto, there had nowhere been such an inversion of values as this sort of Christian thing. So the Christianity comes along and transvalues all the sort of the ancient values. And then obviously the most famous Nietzsche, the death of God. What are we going to do now? Is it too much of a hard sell now to bring Nietzsche to the 21st century when actually to take him seriously, certainly as I read him, to take him seriously at that point, he's actually overturning a whole bunch of very dearly held ideals that he would say have come from Christianity in terms of the God of the cross, pity, compassion, mercy, the kind of descent down to the cross. He thought that was kind of a disgusting idea. So how can you rehabilitate Nietzsche for a 21st century world that seems to be quite happy with compassion and pity and that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not a Nietzschean in that sense, in any case of the word. The reason why I wanted to talk about him is partly because I think that the way that he's interpreted by Regenster gives a very good structural analog to the idea of why the process of creating any new ideal might be difficult. But also the way he attempts to go about it, I think, is structurally informative. I think I like talking about Nietzsche in this context because he's one of the only people that's really tried something like this in such a clear and easy to spot way.
Yes, Felice.
Yeah, I was just interested if you could unpack your kind of idea of unattainable a little bit, because I guess one of the things about nihilism is that it kind of in areas of love, like if you just think it is unattainable to get a person who is a certain way, you can be kind of wrong or right about that. And there's a kind of drive to improvement if you, I guess, are an optimist about the idea that such a person could exist that kind of brings it into being. And I guess part of what you're you're talking about in terms of will to power, I don't know, captures that. But I just wonder, like in the housing crisis, some people's response is to be nihilistic about it, and other people are like, let's change housing policy and become a NIMBY or YIMBY, or, like that's kind of. So I just wonder how you look at unattainability.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. It's one of the things that I tried to bring out at the end there. When Regenster's talking about unattainability, because this is coming from a commentary he's doing on Nietzsche's work, or a book he's written about Nietzsche's work. He's talking about things that are necessarily unattainable. So for an atheistic philosopher, if it's not that God actually did physically die one day, it's that God had never existed and we're just finding out. That's how they'd view it. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's very important, if we're going to use this kind of modified Regenster's framework, which I do think is very, very helpful, is to attempt to separate what is contingently unattainable from what is necessarily unattainable. So when I talk about like the myth of the one in romance, I think that's like necessarily unattainable in a sense that I just don't think it exists. I don't think it's ever existed. And I think we're more conscious of the fact that it doesn't exist now than ever. When I talk about something like, the housing crisis, that's clearly not necessarily unattainable. There are things that you could do in the world to make affording a home easier. If somebody is out on the street, there are things that we collectively could do to help solve that. It's not like it's not like safety and security for that person is necessarily unattainable. It's just contingently. And I'm suggesting those might warrant different approaches. Because, for example, if we start saying that if we view the myth of the one as contingently unattainable, then we might start drifting into what I think are false views, like that, romance was phenomenally good in the 1950s, and as we've all now degenerates or whatever. And I don't agree with that. I think that would be not a view of history that I think is true. Which is why I think that it's important to recognize, to separate out contingent from necessary unattainability. Because if you sort something contingent into the necessary camp, you have given up doing anything like material about it. And if you sort something from the necessary camp into the contingent camp, I think that it can drift us into this sort of like attempts to find a kind of mythical prelapsarian golden age in the past that we need to return to. And I'm not massively a fan of that, unless it's true. I just don't think it's true.
Mm-hmm. You describe yourself as a non-resistant skeptic who finds the idea of God emotionally appealing. Talk to us more about that. What is it about God that's so emotionally appealing to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that largely, one of the reasons why I think I, along with many other people, find the idea of a theistic God emotionally appealing is because we've grown up in a culture where that it has shaped our instincts and affects to desire that. But also, I find the idea of there being a higher mind in which I am just a little bit quite appealing. I don't know why. I think that picture is very appealing, especially if as many of us have grown up with the idea of that God being a sort of an agape-ish love as well. I think that, of course, that's appealing, right? I don't know. Maybe I don't think it's unusual to find that massively appealing. Obviously, if I grew up in a context where we were all Gnostics, I would probably find the idea of God much, much less appealing, because it would be, we'd all be ruled over by the demiurge, and that would be incredibly unpleasant. But I think that it's fairly natural to find the idea of there being an omniscient, omnipotent, loving God quite appealing. I think that obviously, when you get into specifics, I find it much more difficult to find it appealing. But that idea in the abstract, I don't mind. It's depending on where you go from there, whether I'll find the particular God appealing or not. But yeah, partly it's nice to. I think that it's nice to feel like you're a part of a grander teleological project. I don't think it's true, but I think it's nice. providing that teleological project also resonates with you. And I think that there's a straightforward attractiveness about the idea of a positively valenced afterlife, because it's just like, what do you value now? Wouldn't you like there to be more of that? Just quantity-wise. You don't even need to invoke, ideas about dwelling in perfect union with a perfect being. You could just say, what do you like about being alive now? Well, imagine more of that forever. Wouldn't that be great? I think that's the thing. It's very naturally appealing.
It must be fascinating examining yourself as a formerly trained logician. You must see yourself drifting over to all of these emotional pools from all over the place philosophically. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis for you, reading and thinking? Do you catch yourself going, oh, that's logically unsound. That's not valid, but my emotions are pulling me towards this in a vehement way.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't call myself a logician. I was never accomplished enough to do that. But I did spend a lot of my time studying logic, and yeah, you get used to picking out different arguments and being like, oh well, I think that premise might not quite hold. I think this might be unsound there. You get much better at spotting invalid arguments. But also, I think that the thing that's most helpful about logic isn't necessarily, or formal logic, I should say, isn't necessarily that you're kind of sitting around saying, you wrong, you fool. It's more like you lay out arguments that you find, including your own and other people's, in a way that makes them more easily digestible and understandable. And, I think that I think that a very good practice, certainly something that I was taught to do when I was at university, was to, when you're trying to formalize someone else's argument, especially if it's an argument you disagree with, trying to formalize it in a way where it is not obviously invalid or obviously unsound, which is, a much more precise way of saying try and steel man it, because then you've got a framework through which to actually go and do that. So that's what I find most valuable about it. I see logic, unless you're like doing mathematical logic, which is great. Everyone go do mathematical logic; it's loads of fun. But unless that's your specific interest, I think the value in formal logic and formal logic adjacent practices is in laying out arguments clearly and precisely, such that you can then understand the strongest version of a particular position.
Do you think there's any lower hanging fruit for us to snap up as a society? I know that you were very interested by logic because you constantly saw yourself disagreeing with people in the pub, having conversations, going, hang on a second, we're not even arguing about the same thing. Is there anything easy that's nice and reachable for all of us out there to avoid doing that, disagreeing about things that actually you agree on?
I mean, it became a bit of a meme because of Jordan Peterson, but just asking what people mean by things is genuinely quite a good practice, providing that eventually you converge on what you actually do mean by something. Because I think that a lot of disagreements are semantic in nature, and I don't think that just holds for everyday disagreements. I think that holds for a lot of philosophical disagreements as well. Perhaps even more so. I think that, again, I think that the way of cashing this out in a good faith discussion is to, when you find yourself disagreeing with someone, and also when you find yourself disagreeing over a particular statement, just checking that you're using the terms in that statement the same way. And you very well might be, right? It's not like every disagreement is a semantic disagreement, but enough disagreements are semantic disagreements that I think it's worth ruling out. And it's also just not massively difficult. Most people are perfectly willing, in my experience, provided you're not like shouting at them and they're not shouting at you, to just answer, what do you mean by that, in relatively good faith. It helps to phrase it in a way that's slightly less blunt than what do you mean by that. I think that generally we talk in especially online in very, very blunt manners. I think this makes it almost impossible to have a conversation where one person doesn't get annoyed. So, maybe instead of saying, what do you mean by that, you say like, I'm not quite sure I understand you on this one term. Could you just help make it clear to me? People are always much more willing to cooperate if you say the problem might be with me, because it very well might be, right? It might just be that they've been using the term in a perfectly unmysterious way and we've just not been understanding. But yeah, I think I've become really quite big on just the concept of like manners. I think manners are so underrated. We sometimes forget because politeness can be used as a sort of as for people to like be arseholes. That also politeness is quite often the thing that greases the wheel of a conversation with someone that you don't know. Small talk's a very similar thing. As a sort of socially not that skilled teenager, I was always very down on small talk, and as an adult, I've decided that actually we could all do really well to get really good at small talk. Small talk is how you let somebody you've just met know that you don't mean them harm and that you're friendly. That's a great thing. We should do more of that. And politeness, I think, is a very similar thing. The difference between going into a conversation and making a conscious effort to be polite and going into a conversation just without that thought could be the difference between a brilliant discussion where both people learn lots and a discussion where you're immediately both at one another's throats and you both leave the pub feeling very dejected. Yeah, so I don't know. It's an obvious point when you put it like that, but I think we just forget it, partly because it's so obvious.
Let's go to the audience for a few last questions. Back here. Yes. With the glasses.
Yes. Well, you made this claim that you habits
you don't think there's something missing maybe in current culture from the past, or that we shouldn't harken back to elements of the past and say that we shouldn't statue them in the present. And I'd like to ask if you think that there's anything missing about Judeo-Christian society in the sense that we have these values where we value uniqueness maybe, that we value output more, and these sorts of things. But do we have preference rates? Do we have enough thoughts of power maybe?
Oh, I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying that like we have nothing to learn from the past. I'm saying that I'm nervous about crafting a kind of the past was great and we need to return to every part of it. I think it would be very strange if we had nothing to learn from the past, in the same way that it would be very strange if we had to learn everything from the past. Either way, it would imply that there's this kind of incredibly linear kind of line of progress running from past to future, either in the upwards or the downwards direction. Do I think that there's anything do I think there's anything missing from like Judeo-Christian values as a whole? I mean, like, maybe. I think that like you can make an argument. For example, I think this idea of overcoming resistance is very valuable. I think that, and I think it's very useful. I kind of struggle a little bit. Maybe I'm just a bit more intellectually cautious, I suppose, than like a philosophical giant like Nietzsche. In that, like, I struggle to make broad pronouncements about like Judeo-Christian values or anything like that, because like these values have manifested in very different ways across time. And sometimes in ways that I think are great, and sometimes in ways that I think are not so great, and I would like to see less of. And sometimes in ways that I think I'd like to see more of. For example, in my favorite book, The Brothers Karamazov, Christianity is defined as a sort of active, energetic love. I quite like that. I think that's great. Sometimes it's has been construed in very different ways that I might perhaps find less appealing. I like the fact, for example, that in that definition of Christianity, love is energetic, which is that one of the things I think many people find appealing about Nietzsche is the energy behind it. I don't mind the kind of I quite like the concept of overcoming resistance, but I certainly, as I say, I definitely wouldn't call myself a Nietzschean. But I think that nonetheless Nietzsche is very much worth reading. He's got some great concepts and was a genius.
Well, to linger on this point, I think it's really interesting. How much do you actually see these Judeo values shaping our society today? There's a bit of an argument as to whether the Judeo-Christian values shape the society that we now look at, with things like equality of life, mattering, being bestowed to us by God. But then someone else will say, yeah, but this is kind of an elephant and a rider situation, where the elephant is us and the rider is Christianity. And they think that they're controlling everything, but actually just downstream from being human beings and having values that we inherently feel a desire towards, we would have developed these values anyway, and Christianity happened to be there.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, first is that I think that when we start saying things like, Judeo-Christian values did this, or just like Christianity did this, or Christianity did that, I think we can get like, clearly that's going to eventually be cashed out in much more specific statements. And I imagine I might endorse quite a lot of those specific statements, right? Like, so you might say, for example, that William Wilberforce was motivated by his ardent Christianity. That's the statement I'd agree with, right? I think that when we, I think it's quite a lot about when we're talking about whether giving credit to a particular idea that has encompassed lots and lots of different ideas at various points in history and various different locations. I think that we can find. I think that quickly we can end up in a place where we're talking in such abstract terms that I don't really know what to say in response to them. Obviously, there is a very like obvious and uncontroversial sense in which Christianity has shaped our current world, right? That too cashes out in terms of more specific statements about particular people who believe particular things about particular times. I would like to see like just more analysis of those particular people at particular times. I think that's a very interesting and very valuable thing to study and talk about. In terms of whether it's like the rider or the elephant, I just couldn't say. I literally don't know. When people say things like, "Oh, would this have happened if Christianity hadn't existed?" I just don't know how to check something like that. Like as in, yeah, maybe. But like, if you ask me to imagine a world where Christianity hadn't existed, you're asking me to like, I mean, when would you? I mean, I'm not a historian, but when would you say that like Christianity is okay? Let's pick a date where Christianity is definitely the most prominent religion in Europe. So let's say like 1000 AD. Like if you ask me what the nearest possible world or the nearest possibility is where Christianity doesn't exist for 1000 AD, let's say, or that Christianity never existed. Now you're asking me to imagine a scenario where like I, in my imagination, go back over 1000 years and try and answer the question, what would the world have looked like if this pretty major force didn't happen? You know, I didn't even know how to answer the question, what would the world look like if World War I didn't happen, let alone what would the world look like if Christianity never happened. But that's way further back. And I, you know, it's an interesting question. I just suspect that it's so difficult to answer. You know, and maybe there are different methodologies and different philosophical approaches you could try and use. But when my like natural one, which is a kind of a counterfactual using possible worlds, would be to try and do this imaginative process. I just don't know how to do that. It's a fun exercise, but I don't think that I would get any reliable information from it. Like I could say things like, oh well, maybe if the Emperor Constantine hadn't become Christian, then maybe he would have managed the empire after the point where he'd won that monumental battle differently, and maybe this. And I think that would genuinely be fun. You can have a really good afternoon, where you can have a really good afternoon with somebody who knows more about Roman history talking about that. But I'd be very hesitant about putting much stock in what the results of that conversation would be. But I could be wrong there.
We've got time for one more question. We don't. All right. Well, I've been overruled. Joe Foley, thank you so much.